Hey, everybody. Welcome to Sweater Weather, a podcast about Canadian arts and culture. I'm your host, Aaron Giovanone. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Tom Wayman, the author of more than 20 books of poetry and prose, as well as a professor emeritus in the Department of English at the University of Calgary. That's where I got to know him first as a teacher and mentor. For several decades, Tom has made his permanent residence at Appledore, an acreage in Winlaw, British Columbia. In 2015, Tom was named a literary landmark by the Vancouver Public Library. That's quite an honor. Today, we'll be talking about his award winning collection of essays, If You're Not Free at Work, Where Are You Free? Literature and Social Change, which was published by Guernica Press in 2018. And if I'm not mistaken, Tom will also be treating us with a reading of a couple of his poems. But before getting to our interview with Tom, we have just a little bit of business to take care of. Sweater Weather is delighted to announce that we are now part of the Harbinger Media Network, a community of progressive podcasts transmitting from the world to come, as their tagline says. I'm honored to be among such illustrious company with my podcast comrades. So check out their terrific lineup of shows at harbingermedianetwork.com. And as always, if you enjoy what I'm doing at Sweater Weather, be sure to like, share, retweet our stuff wherever you see it out there on social media. And if you have the means, consider making a donation to help us keep going and growing. You can make a monthly donation to the show on Patreon or a one time donation on PayPal. You'll find the links to those services in the show notes and on our website, which is sweaterweatherpod.com. Okay, let's get on with our interview with Tom Wayman, talking about his book, If You're Not Free at Work, Where Are You Free? Thanks, Tom, for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to take part.
In the introduction to your essay collection, If You're Not Free at Work, Where Are You Free? You write that what concerns you most is, quote, a missing and accurate depiction in art of the effects of people's daily employment on their lives, on and off the job. So I'm wondering, why you think art doesn't depict people's work lives accurately, and what you think the value of such a depiction would be.
Well, in answer to the first question, why our artistic world doesn't have an accurate depiction of of the job and how the job affects people, not just at work but off work, I think there's two reasons I would argue. One is just historically who the artists were often people that had leisure to make art, and so they didn't. It wasn't a subject that they were that interested in. Let's put it that way. And then from that, there grew a kind of a culture where work was just a taboo subject. Like why would you write about that? We came to those sort of three major focuses of art: nature, love, and death. And then in the 20th century, we added art about art. So there's kind of the four main things. So the historical reason why work isn't there was one reason. The other is, and that's what I argue in various essays and things, is that when we look at the experience of daily work for most people, we're not free at work. So in the sense of it's not a democratic place. As soon as you enter the office or the factory, you're subject to absolutely arbitrary authority, and then when you leave work, you emerge, and then somehow you're supposed to be a citizen of a democratic country. And so this constant shuttling back and forth is not something the art world wants to spend a lot of time looking at, I think, because no one likes to think of themselves as being subject to, if you grew up in a democratic country, you don't like to think of yourself as being subject at the heart of the day to a lack of democracy. So anyway, that's why I think people sort of turn up a blind eye. People in the art world turn a blind eye to daily employment. The value of depicting it, I think, is sort of threefold. One is it lets us know where things come from. You're wearing a particular shirt, and so am I. Where do they come from? What are people's lives like that we touch when we put on these shirts? And the reason why that's important, I think, really was underlined by the pandemic, where we found that the people that we thought were taking care of the old folks in long term care, that what their lives were like were invisible, and therefore when things went south, they really went far south, and that if the art world had included that, we would be much more aware of of that, the long term care kind of massacre. So one of the three things, and why I think art, what um, art about work can do, is that issue of teaching us where things come from and what people's lives are like in order for us to get them. The second would just be to really raise that issue that I talked about a few minutes ago about democracy. If at the heart of the day, if at the part of the day where we make our contribution to the community, which is the workplace, is not democratic, then what makes this a democratic society? And again, we see this issue reflected in the larger culture now as things start to fall apart. So you have the Trumpians all not being that interested in democracy, but to me it makes a kind of sense, because they're constantly told, you're in a democratic society, you're in a democratic society, you're the free citizen of a democracy, but that's not your daily experience. That kind of uh, disconnect is not helpful. And I think if there was if in art, art about work was as central to the art world as it is to everyday life, that issue of democracy would get explored more. The third reason why I think it's important is that currently, um, you can see, in the academic world, in the media, and especially in the art world, a lot of effort is being put in to divide Canadians from each other. So there's no news items. The only time work ever gets into the news is when people don't work. That is when there's a strike, right? But all the issues of of um, of daily work that could, if it was focused on, I think reveals enormously about what the society is like. Um, I just think it helps work against that division that we're having now, the us against them attitude that's really prevalent. Instead of trying to see us as a whole, and how can we all help each other, that, to me, that's something that art could contribute to. And it's, again, to me, it underscores that need to bring into the center of the world of art a consideration of how our daily work affects us. And again, I'll keep stressing, not just on the job, but how do we feel about ourselves when we leave work? Um, how have we been treated and valued or not valued, so on. That these just have repercussions, in the family, in the community, that I think are really important.
Do you think the fact that work isn't represented, tends not to be represented in art, is really more true of literature than other kinds of art? Because there is a tradition in television of the workplace comedy. There's a kind of a rather long
Yes.
tradition of that. The Office, or the British or American version, is a great example. More recent one is Superstore, which is all about people who work in a kind of like a Walmart. Um, then there are all those dramas on television of professional class occupations. Those dramas about lawyers, the police, doctors. What do you make of those representations of work?
Well, I think those are essentially science fiction. Like they're fantasies about those jobs, and I like comedy as well as anybody. And I think some of that, that stuff like The Office and so on, it does capture some of the absurdities of it, but it's not real. It's not what those jobs are like. And so, um, I guess you can say it's better than nothing, but I guess the rule of thumb always uses insider versus outside. So if it's work produced by someone who's inside those professions, it's going to be different. They usually hire a cop or a lawyer as an advisor, but believe me, it's not. You know, people working in an office have lots and lots of stories, as you know. It's just it's just different when you see it with an insider's eye. Even the comedy is different because one theory of comedy says it's the unusual that we laugh at, and so an insider knows what's usual on a job and what's unusual. So on any job and on through shop talk, there's some jokes that go around, but sometimes they're not. Um, it's not what you would see on on TV because they have to talk to an audience that doesn't know the inside. So those jokes get kind of homogenized. Doesn't mean they're not funny, but it's a different kind of humor than an accurate than one that it's designed to be an accurate reflection of those jobs.
I would say of the humor especially, it's, yeah, maybe, it's not really it's not realist. I don't think they're,
Yeah.
I don't think realism is one of their main goals. Um, so yeah, I would generally agree with you on that. What are some examples of art, about work that you do enjoy, you might recommend?
Yeah. Well, in terms of work literature, like I divided up into sort of work memoirs, work poems, and work fiction because that's what I see. So if people are looking for examples for work memoir, I would always suggest they read Sid Marty's Men for the Mountains, which is an account of not it's both Sid Marty's own experience working as a park warden in Canada's Rocky Mountain parks, but into that book he weaves the history of the park warden service. It's just an amazing book, how well he brings that off, and it's very much an insider's eye. So just one tiny example. I won't do this with all these, but um, at one point, the bureaucrats won't let the wardens be out in the cabins. They want them all based in Banff. So he's talking about a guy who's sitting in his office and he's got the window open. He's got one hand dangling out the window, and Sid says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm maintaining contact with the alpine environment," which just sort of sums up all that frustration and stuff. Okay, and then Kate Braid, who's the Vancouver poet and writer, has two work memoirs, one called Journeywoman and one called Hammer and Nail, which is about her 15 years in construction as a journey carpenter. And again, very, very articulate. Some of the accounts are funny, some are poignant, some are angry. It's very moving kind of writing. In terms of work poems, as opposed to work memoir, I think of, like, just to take Calgary for an example, Tyler Perry's book collection, Plausible Wrong Answers, which is about being a high school teacher in Calgary. The title of the book comes from multiple choice exams where you have the right answer and then you have some plausible wrong answers, which is such a lovely phrase. And so he's talking about the frustrations of teaching to that kind of structure, and I think does a good job. Um, some of the women in trades have written really strong books. There's a Boston electrician, Susan Eisenberg, who has a book called Pioneering, because she was in one of the first classes where they would apprenticeship classes where they would allow women in, and she's actually made all kinds of art out of that, her experiences on the trades. She has a website that you can walk through, um, which deals with a number of issues, including sexual harassment on the job. And she's also done some art installations about women in construction. Again, just sticking to Alberta, I think of Kelly Shepard, a young writer in Edmonton, who did a book called Insomnia Bird, which is in part about his adventures in the oil patch, in a subsidiary thing. And if just to give you an idea of the range of what's possible, there's a woman in Oregon, Ginger Rogers, who's done a number of books. She and her sisters have a house cleaning business. They'll come in and clean house. She has a book called Hurricane Sisters, because they'll go through your house like a hurricane, cleaning it up. And again, they're quite poignant about it. So those are just some examples of work poems. So we got work memoir, work poems. When it comes to work fiction, that's where it's a lot thinner on the ground. I often refer people to Alistair MacLeod's book, No Great Mischief, because in that book, he gives you a series of workplaces, drift and development miners from Cape Breton, people back home in Cape Breton and what they work at. What's interesting in that book, though, is that his main character, who's supposed to be an ophthalmologist, you're never given a picture of that guy at work. And I thought, not that it mars the book. It's a great book because, to be honest, the work world is discussed in terms of a family nexus. Like what does the family expect of people? Here in the Kootenays, there's a writer, Ernst Hakkinen, who for many years lived in Vancouver. He has a wonderful book of short stories called All Night Gas Bar, because for a while he worked staffing one of those all-night gas stations, and he would work on his writing when there wasn't customers, but he gets held up 2 or 3 times and has all kinds of adventures. So it's funny and interesting. And again, from the East Kootenay area, there's a woman called Maureen Brownlee, who has a book called Logger's Daughters, which is a fictional account of sort of the effect on family and the community of that world of resource extraction, in this case timber logging. So those are just some examples that I think are pretty strong. There's not a lot in the art world generally, but in writing, if you look hard enough, there are these examples that I collect and cherish and all that. I once went to I was in New York, and one of the unions had an art show called Americans at Work, and I was all excited and went there, and I even have the the brochure that went with it. Not one of the art pieces in there showed anybody on the job. It was incredible. It was either strikes or it was portraits of people. The one thing that was missing was any sense of what work is like and how it affects you as a person and the larger community. So it was kind of a stunning bad example, but understandable given that work is such an absent subject in the art world. I've seen those murals of Diego Rivera at the Detroit Institute of Arts, where he was commissioned to do the Ford, the whole concept of the conveyor belt assembly line. And what he does is he paint, because he's an outsider just looking at it, people have no faces or very few faces, which really didn't feel like working on those jobs where you're very aware of the personalities that you're working with. But of course, to an outsider, it's that's what you don't see. So it doesn't mean it isn't great art. Don't get me wrong, but it's just
It is a question of
it's
point
just
of view.
yeah
Yeah.
yeah
And this may also speak to the specialization of writing, of doing art, how it's a specialized profession in itself. So people who do it often don't have other kinds of jobs, and they have a very particular kind of job.
yes
Yeah, maybe we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a little bit, I think. But maybe this would be a good opportunity if you'd indulge me in reading one of your poems. It's, I think, from one of your early collections that I reread again recently. I really liked, and I thought it would be nice if you could read it for us. It's called "The Country of Everyday Literary Criticism" from 1974.
Okay,
Do
yeah.
you have any comments about the poem to introduce it?
Well, this was my second book of poems, and I was living in Vancouver and very much involved in the milieu, working myself at all kinds of odd jobs, and active in a kind of you know the radical fringe of the labor movement, which in Vancouver was even the mainstream labor movement was quite social change oriented and stuff. So um, lots and lots of stories. I did a series of poems called "The Country of Every Day." Again, trying to focus on the issues of everyday life. So this was one of them, called "Country of Every Day: Literary Criticism." He was in a hurry, Wood said. The young foreman, only 26, down on his knees at the base of the heavy lamppost, impatient to push it back on the block. He was yelling at the rest of us to give him a hand, and didn't see the top of the pole as it swayed over and touched the power line. I was looking right at him. There was a flash, and he just folded over onto his side and turned black. His ears melted. There were 2 holes burned in the pavement where his knees were. Somebody started giving him mouth to mouth, and I said, "Forget it. I mean, he's dead." And there are poets who can enter in to the heart of a door and discover the rat inside us that must be kept caged in the head because it is perfectly sane. There are poets who claim to know what it's like to have a crucifix wedged in the throat, unable to swallow, and how the knot of the stomach turns into a bowl of fire. But around and ahead of them is the housewife endlessly washing linoleum, sheets, fruit dishes, her hands, and the face of a child. And there's the girl who stands in the cannery line 12 hours in season to cut out the tips of the fish. For the paper they tear out to write on is pulled from the weeks of working graveyard and all the weariness of mill work, the fatigue of keeping it going, the urge to reclaim the body for the hours not working or sleeping when the body ends too tired for much but a beer and a laugh. Beside every dazzling image, each line desperate to search the unconscious, are the 1,000 hours someone is spending watching ordinary television. For every poet who considers the rhythm of the word dark and the word darkness, a crew is balancing high on the grid of a new warehouse roof, gingerly taking the first load of lumber hauled 30 feet up to them. For every hour someone reads critical articles, Swede is drunk in the bar again, describing how he caught his sleeve once in the winch of an oil rig, whirling him round till his ribs broke. And for every rejection of a manuscript, a young apprentice is riding up on the crane to work his first day on high steel. Left my fingerprints in the metal when I had to grab a beam to get off, he says. And Ed Shaw stands looking down into the hold where a cable sprang loose, lifting a pallet and lashed across the dock, just touching one of the crew whose body they are starting to bring up from the water. When the poet goes out for a walk in the dusk, listening to his feet on the concrete, pondering all of the adjectives for rain, he's walking on work of another kind and on lives that wear down like cement. Somewhere a man is saying, "Worked 20 years for the city, but I'm retired now." Sitting alone in a room in the poorhouse of a pension, he has never read a modern poem. I, I should say, well, thank you. I should say there's a lot of death and industrial accidents in that poem. Partly because for me that was what was so dramatic when I began to first pay attention, and lots of there's lots of stories about that, of those. The BC poet Howie White had a whole series of poems called Accidents, and each one was more horrible than the next. He kind of collected them based on his own experience and stories. But if I had to be serious for a moment, I'd say it's again, to me, you have a skewed society when you're not paying attention to work, and death on the job is one of those ways that we don't pay much attention to that. When um, when the Canadians were in Afghanistan for no good reason, um, shooting and killing and getting killed, um, one of the things that was stunning for me, because I was living in Calgary at the time, was more people were killed in 1 year on the job in Alberta than in all the 10 years that Canadians were fighting in Afghanistan. And all through the country, they named sections of Highway of Heroes. Like somehow you were a hero if you died in Afghanistan to prop up the Karzais and all that stuff. But if you went out to build Alberta and died on the job, then it was just you're just totally expendable. You weren't a hero somehow. Um,
Except when there's a coronavirus crisis and you're
yes,
very briefly made a hero for going to work, where the
yes,
material
sure,
circumstances, the danger that you're in at work is made very briefly like a part of the media narrative. It's part of the story
yes,
that's out
yeah,
there that has been one of the side effects of this whole crisis was revealing how different kinds of work put people in different kinds of
yes. No, you're
danger.
absolutely correct. And even that issue of what is essential work, like what jobs in the community are not essential, is the hard thing to find. Actually, no, I in a way I'm optimistic, provided we all live, of course. That what will come out of this maybe will be more focus on some of these ideas that we're talking about here um, that you can't simply ignore. It, you know, work in its various effects.
Moving on to another essay in this collection, it's titled "Why Profess What Is Abhorred: The Rescue of Poetry." You explore the fact that people tend to dislike poetry. It's something that I've also noticed, Tom, as a poet myself. And it is an interesting fact. And like you point this out in your essay, sure, it's natural enough that people would prefer one art form to another, say the movies to the theater. But the active hatred of poetry, it is unique. It seems unique to me and maybe kind of strange. And you're not the first poet to think about it and write about why this might be the case. Where do you think this hatred of poetry comes from?
Okay, yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that blows my mind is it's not just between genres, but people might like some kind of music and not like other kinds of music, but they won't say I hate music the way they'll say I hate poetry. I think the roots of it, though, the first is in a way going back to the historical, like what are the subjects of the poems that were shown in school, and how little they often relate to our everyday life. When I went, it's a long time ago, but when I went to school, there was almost nothing about any kind of Canadian writing was ever looked at, and even in university, it was all sort of British, and by British, of course, it was kind of upper class concerns. So 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 people, I think there's a disconnect there. But also to stay on the subject of what school does to poetry is that it's quite often made. Um, it's like an instrument of torture. We assign these poems, and then people have to answer questions about them. Um, I mentioned Tyler Perry's book called Plausible Wrong Answers. And he really gets into that in there with about how poems are mangled by the kinds of questions that are asked about them. If your only exposure to popular music was that you had to answer a whole bunch of questions about it in school and be graded on it, I doubt that it would be very popular. Also, some poets have tried to work against that. Billy Collins, who was the American Poet Laureate, um, in the 2000s for a while, he started a site and did some anthologies. The site is still up in the Library of Congress called Poetry 180, where he wanted to turn around that hatred of poetry 180 degrees. And he also was aware that the average teaching year in the American high schools is 180 days. So his anthologies each contain, and it's also in the online anthology, 180 contemporary poems that he thinks have enough punch to interest high school students, to show them, maybe there is a lot of good stuff going on in poetry. So, there is this pushback, but still, I still meet lots and lots of people that come out of high school and they just hate poetry. It's just anathema. If I can say though, there is one art form that is less liked than poetry, which is modern dance. And so if you've ever gone to a modern dance thing, where just like often the audience for poetry is other poets, but that's also true with modern dance, where they try to find the most irritating music to dance to, and then people roll around on the floor for no good reason that you can understand, and stuff like that. So the idea of the arts as excluding people, it's not just poetry, but it is poetry too.
Given everything that's it has going against it, why do you think poetry is important, Tom?
Okay, well, part of it's my own experience. I grew up in the '60s, where poetry was quite important to the Canadian nationalist um, effort. Um, for a while there in the late '60s, there was a real determination to have a country, and its poets were as important as its fiction writers. So a new book of poems by Irving Layton or Dorothy Livesey or Earl Burney, that was a big deal because they were going to be talking about Canada and how people lived here and so on. And even in the social protest movements that I was part of, the um, anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist stuff, poetry played a big part in that. There was very few alternative newspapers that didn't have poems. Also, the women's movement, women's publications. So I saw that poetry was a place where people could articulate their feelings in a way that somehow in prose they couldn't, or they felt intimidated about, or something. So that's one reason I think it's potentially important, and obviously that links to where I think an examination of work and its effects on people and on the community. Um, Poetry has a role in that. Poetry also is one of the only things in our society that's completely outside the money economy. There's absolutely no money to be made in poetry, and that you can't say that about. I can't think of another art form that's so divorced from um, the money economy. It's like a little free space in an area that's all influenced by money. I think in some essay I say people wouldn't go to church if they had to meet outside, right? You want a nice, comfortable building, and all that costs big bucks. So there's always this pitches for money, money, money. People won't go jogging, without a $250 outfit, or maybe that's low now, given you can probably pay that for shoes. Um, but a poet can just have a piece of paper and a stub of a pencil and create art. So again, it's something to cherish at a time where money is seen as the main sort of value. The other thing that poetry can do, um, at its best, it can evoke worlds. Like we have all these ways we talk about poetry being evocative or resonant, and I'll just indulge myself here by giving you some examples, short ones, but this is um, the Oregon poet William Stafford, and it's a poem he has was in a magazine called Poetry East, which had its 100th issue just as the pandemic closed in, and the editor made these selections. So this is Stafford talking about the writing of the poet Robert Bly, the American poet Robert Bly, and I'm going to give you a tiny example of Bly too. So this is Stafford. He calls this "Notice a Bly Prescription." He says, "These pages are good for you. They enhance your life. A few of them every day, mixed with ordinary reading, will keep up your appetite, provide incentive, and maintain hope. One page supplies 20% of the minimum daily requirement of wonder and mystery. Along with religion, they will sustain you even in conditions of extreme stress. For chronic spiritual anemia, you should consult your family poet. No government has established the minimum daily requirements of honesty and trust, but no society has ever lasted without at least trace elements of these essentials richly present in these pages. So it's kind of like a praise poem to poetry generally, but also to Bly and his stuff, because Bly can get down to I think some fundamental things about what we have inside us. So I'm just going to give you a little translation of a little poem by Kabir, Kabir was an Indian poet. He was a weaver. He dies in 1400, he's born in 1400, which, if you remember, is when Chaucer dies. So if you like, a contemporary of Chaucer, but this is a Bly translation. Whenever Bly translates anything, it sort of gets translated into Bly-ese, where he's thinking about what we have inside us. So the poem's called "The Radiance in Your Mother's Womb," and just short, it says, "I talk to my inner lover, and I say, why such rush? We sense that there's some sort of spirit that loves birds and animals and the ants, perhaps the same one who gave a radiance to you in your mother's womb. Is it logical you'd be walking around entirely orphaned now? The truth is, you turned away yourself and decided to go into the dark alone. Now you're tangled up with others and have forgotten what you once knew. And that's why everything you do has some weird failure in it." So I really love that last line, because it's possible to look at your life like that everything you do has got some kind of weird failure. Nothing quite works, but I just, to me, it's the kind of words put together in a way that open doors for me to think about what it is to be alive, and it can be funny too. I'll just do one more. The editor of poetry teaches at DePaul University in Chicago, Richard Jones. He's got some translations of Basho, the Japanese haikuist. Basho's a contemporary of Milton, John Milton, Paradise Lost and all that. It's just to give you, but he's got this great little thing where he says, this is a Basho haiku. He says, "Thank goodness for clouds. Clouds give us poets a break from our moon gazing." And I thought, wow, because it's both to me metaphorical, the idea that bad times, clouds, give a break from moon gazing, where we don't pay attention to what's going on. It also could be taken literally, because in Japan at that time, it was a big deal for people from the court to go out and look at the moon, and then they'd all write haiku and poems about it. So it works both, to me anyway, works both literally and metaphorically, but it's also kind of funny, I think. So if I have to defend what poetry can do at its best, those are just some ways that I would do it, no matter what the subject. I think there's work poems that also open doors, but in these sort of short, sharp takes, I think it gives back at its best. Poetry gives back to the reader some wonderful insights, but also some wonderful opportunities to follow some thoughts and feelings in directions that otherwise you'd maybe never encounter.
Maybe I'll follow up here. It's a question I didn't mention, but I didn't write this down before, Tom. But I was just thinking, as a follow up to this, you mentioned poetry's relationship to money, and it's a rather, it's an art form that you don't really make any money doing it itself. Not many people do. But I mean, a few people do probably, right? So it seems like maybe every generation there's like one poet who's allowed to be famous. And so right now that's linked very intimately to social media. So somebody like Rupi Kaur, she's a
Yeah.
big personality on Instagram, and I don't know how many millions of followers she has, but partly because of her presence there, then she can, print and publish and print a book and sell it. And it's the book. It's like the one book of poetry, contemporary poetry, that's in like an airport bookstore, right? So there's that kind of a poet who can get famous, and of course there's all the other kinds of poets, I guess, kind of like you and a little bit like me, who don't make you don't make money from your poetry, but it is part of like a kind of an overall profession related to teaching, maybe being in academia, and how and writing poetry and researching poetry and publishing about it is part of like a larger professional profile that you do like ultimately get paid for, right? So how do you think of poetry working into these systems, either of, I guess, of kind of a fame, or of, I suppose, or of professionalism?
Okay, well, first of all, I think you're really accurate. Like the story I love about Allen Ginsberg, who was wildly known all around the world, but
Yeah.
his books actually didn't sell that well. He was able to buy an apartment in New York City because he sold his papers to the university in Texas that gave him I think $1 million so he could buy an apartment. But it was not his poems, but rather all the extraneous stuff of being a writer, all the correspondence and so on that the society valued. The issue of fame. Oh yeah, and then I just wanted to say that, yeah, the phenomena of the social media poet that you mentioned in the '60s, it was a writer called Rod McEwen who also sold a zillion copies. There were records you could buy of him, reading and stuff like that. So I agree with you totally that often they single out one particular um, particular poet that but
Rod McEwen. I mean, when I was a kid and it would end up in a used bookstore, I mean, a teenager, let's say, if you went to the poetry section, it was all Rod McEwen books
yes,
that people
yeah,
had sold. I was like, well, who was this guy? Of course, not really remembered at all anymore,
no,
oddly. But yeah, he was the famous poet of that generation.
but the issue of fame is interesting. There was a San Francisco writer, Lou Welch, who did a little book of little poems called Course College, and he's got one in there for fame, in which he says, "Fame, more people know you than you know," and I always loved
That's all
that
it
because
is.
because
It's kind of true.
if you don't know them, they really don't know you, right? Like it just Welch had that kind of crazy wisdom that sometimes poets have, where they just get to the gist of things in very few words. Um, yeah, so there's that. Other than that, I think yeah, fame or even literary success um, is not always a good thing. You think of all those writers, say fiction writers, who become famous for it's probably better to be on the edge of things in some ways. Although we all love external validation because it can be pretty lonely, writing things that you feel people didn't respond to um, in any great. But there's a joy um, in artistic creation that I think outweighs the lack of fame, when you can make words do what you want them to do. And again, I don't think you should underestimate that joy of creativity. There's a dark side to it too, where people can come real depressed. That famous image of um, poets in their youth begin with gladness and end up, you know, discouraged and depressed and insane and stuff. Um, but we know from the Buddhists that that's because they had expectations, right? But the Buddhists say, just don't have any expectations, and you'll have a much happier life. So I think um, my good friend, the late California poet Dennis Sala, used to say, it what you want in poetry is tiny thinking. He said, like you want to just really enjoy the writing. So fame as a writer eluded him, but he said, "Look, I still have the words. The words are still coming. I still get to write. I didn't get so discouraged, or didn't start off where it looked like I was going to be famous and well known, and then tastes change and you're pushed aside." All his life, he just died in November. All his life, he had projects to write on. So I kind of learned from him that that's more important than anything, to be excited by projects you're writing on. fame is maybe not as enjoyable as people imagine it to be.
I wouldn't know, but
I,
I
yeah,
tend to
as
agree.
far as I can tell, writers that I know that are really well known talk about how they don't have a lot of time because there's these constant demands on them that isn't what they want to be doing, which is writing. So
In 2014, Tom, you published a lengthy essay critiquing postmodernism, and you include that essay in this in the book we're talking about today too. And you especially critique its role in the arts and education. And this essay really prefigured, I think, some of the several critiques of postmodernism that, if anything, have become more prominent since you wrote the essay in 2014. So in that essay, you write, "quote that postmodernist belief constitutes a conservative initiative aimed at pacifying campus and community alike is no secret." So this is an interesting critique, and I'd like you to maybe get into it a little bit more. So, how would you define postmodernism, and why does it come to prominence in universities, as you stress, after the protests and the social movements of the late 1960s?
okay, yeah, I'll just say that I don't think my essay prefigured because I try to look in there, at people that have made this point before. But the way what I'm describing is as postmodernism is a set of ideas about writing and society that rose to prominence not just in English departments but in anthropology departments and archaeology departments and so on. And the best digest to this set of ideas, I think, is Donald Trump, um, because it begins with the idea that there is no truth. Truth is just relative, and that gets pushed pretty hard in these when people want to present it. The second is that science is bunk. That is that since there is no truth, you can't have a scientific truth, and so um, referring to science as a any kind of reference point is pointless because it's as untrue as anything else. A corollary of that is that words can mean anything. So you see Trump, if you attack him for racism, then you're a racist. That kind of thing, which has its parallels in the academy and in people who took it up from there into the media and the art world. Um, Form is more important than content. So if you think of Trump's form as a guy who's fighting back against the elites, right? Whereas in fact, here is this multi-billionaire. The content is he's part of that world, but it doesn't matter. It's the form,
The style.
um,
It's his style.
style. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe that's a better word. Um, it's the vision of a zero-sum world, so that if if um, if you succeed, I have to fail. And again, you see that in Trump. It's winners and losers. Everybody can't win, and that's embedded in this kind of mindset too. And then finally, I would argue it it all these factors are somehow supposed to be left wing. Um, that is, that there has to be something in it that's supposed to be for ordinary working people. And again, you think of Trump managing to convince people of that, but there's a long history of that where postmodern theorists and specialists consider themselves left wing, even though it's a very very conservative movement. I'll say too, if you can take a step back, um, that it's themselves that call themselves postmodernism, but modernism itself is quite conservative. If you think um, of modernist writers like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or even Yeats, all of whom have quite a bit of association with a series of right wing ideas. Eliot, quite an anti-Semite, and Yeats wrote marching songs for the Irish fascists, the blue shirts. You have Pound, who was a real fascist. I mean, we use that term meaning bad person, but he actually thought Mussolini was a great believer in modernist art, and did all these broadcasts. Like Eliot, he's quite an anti-Semite, as were a number of the modernist painters, Renoir, Degas, all those guys. Were often quite anti-Semitic. There's a whole structure in modernism that was quite conservative. So, in my heart of hearts, I don't really think postmodernism is postmodernism. It's kind of a Baroque version of modernism. A kind of all those ideas pushed ahead. I think it's more like a development. But why was it brought in? I think, and again, this is just my take on it. The campuses are in an uproar around all those issues: feminism, civil rights, and anti-Vietnam War, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, which I think that universities could tolerate to a certain extent. But what began to happen starting in 1968 was that students who had been at the forefront of all this began to make contact with young workers. So in the May Days in France, you had this kind of unity between young workers who didn't like what was happening in society, and um, and in and students, young students. The same was true with in the States, where there began to be links between sort of young groups of young workers. I think of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit, which was employees at Dodge who were black mostly. Drum was mostly a black outfit, but there were some white ones too, where that scared, I believe, the powers that be, and so they needed an ideology in the camp on the campuses that would dampen things down quiet, and because young students were so sure of themselves, they were sure that their critique of society was accurate. Postmodernism begins with that sense that nothing is true. That's the fundamental idea. So you start to undermine people's beliefs, so that they can't confront you with a set of ideas because nothing is true. Um, and and then along with that, the reward for accepting this is that sense of an elite. Only a few people know about these postmodern beliefs, and you're somehow an elite if you know that. So postmodernist um, uh, critical work or scientific work is loaded with jargon and obscure terms and new terms for old things, which builds a wall between students who want to talk about what's wrong in society and what might be done about it, and the general population. You basically sabotage the language, sabotage the communication that's possible. So it really worked in quite a way. So that the campuses calmed right down, and then as is usual with any kind of sort of totalitarian belief set like postmodernism, people turn on each other. So then you have people ripping each other's faces off on campus for not being correct about this and not being correct about that, and stuff. And again, I think the powers that be can tolerate that. I mean, but it's just they really want it to end, and in large measure have that link between young people on the campuses who see some flaws in society, and have some ideas about how to change it. But if they can't talk to the larger population, perfect. It's just perfect. It just becomes contained in that silo, um, and that's my sense of why it came in with a huge rush. Otherwise, it's hard to understand. Um, it, that
But why it would be accepted. I mean, I guess we're
yeah,
talking about sort of two different things in a way. There's the theories of that inform postmodernism that really come out of, I guess, a critique of language, right? About how language works. This is why there's so much. There's a problematization of how just language works to signify this or that thing, and I guess
right.
I guess one of the understandings you come away with from postmodernism is that, oh, like language is it essentially it's socially constructed. Like what the meaning of words is part of a large social system that comes to an agreement about what words are. Partly through saying that this word doesn't mean its opposite. And so there's, I mean, it's a kind of a theory that I'm not like that adept at explaining, partly because I'm like I'm kind of I don't really accept some of its premises,
Yeah.
but like I understand some of these basic claims that language is problematic. It doesn't really mean what you think it means when you're using it, and so because there's not that natural link to meaning, then somehow this is where things get really fuzzy. Somehow it makes sense to, in the arts anyway, in literature and in poetry, is to make your language even more obscure, make it hard to understand, because somehow this is highlighting the fact of non-understanding, which is essentially always part of reading and writing. That probably sounds rather convoluted. It's partly my fault, and
No,
it's
no.
partly the fault of these theories, though, too.
Yeah,
So
it doesn't sound convoluted to me at all. I think you're 100% right. The notion that we don't all mean the same thing by the same words is actually not a new discovery. There's a wonderful writer, actually of German origin, B. Traven, the guy who wrote the original novel that the Humphrey Bogart movie Treasure of the Sierra Madre is was taken from. Um, Traven has a series of novels about the 1911 revolt against Diaz in Mexico, and they're set in Chiapas. And one of them, which is a novel called it's called General from the Jungle. Uh, it begins with the slogan of the rebels against Diaz in Chiapas, which was "Land and bread, land and bread." And the whole first half of the first chapter, he talks about all the different meanings that the people in the army had for that phrase. Like he points out, what I mean by land and bread isn't what you mean. But, and this is the most important but, we can we can unite around that slogan because what we're looking for is complementary. We want land to be able to raise our food, and we want to we want to be fed. We want, through our own efforts. Um, and that's the part that's not there, is the idea that um, that we can unite rather than be divided, and all attain our goals, or at least take steps towards attaining goals. It's not just me against you. Like if your group gets ahead, then mine doesn't. That's a zero sum thinking that just seems to underlie um, this kind of of conversation. Postmodern
well, yeah. I
thinking.
mean, it depends what kind of group we're talking about, too. I mean, I think one of the things with postmodernism that we stop looking at is as how capitalism works, and there is a bit of a zero sum function there
Yeah.
of what capitalists get, workers don't, and vice
Yes.
versa. So, but that's a relationship that I think a lot of I mean, again, this is kind of these are broad terms we're using, but at least the way that I experience postmodern theory in university through the writing and the study of literature, it really obscured all of that sense of class, about those kind of
Yeah.
that particular power structure for some reason wasn't really often talked about. And so in your essay, you draw like many of the examples when you're speaking about postmodernism, like from poetry. So do you think poetry was particularly impacted by postmodern beliefs? And maybe you could speak generally about how you think it influenced the writing and the study of literature.
Well, I think I use poetry as examples because um, that's where I encountered it, and in the teaching and study and writing of poetry, and that huge wave of obscurity that came rolling in, all with theories that were supposed to explain why this stuff was so good. But it's also in conceptual art. Like where I live, there's an artist-run center that has a whole series of visiting artists, really from around the world, like where they can do it, and it's all conceptual art. So you go and look at this stuff, and it's really bad badly done. But they always have these elaborate descriptions on the walls about why this stuff is a work of genius. And it's kind of like the emperor with no clothes. Like anybody walking in would say, "Well, this isn't very good," but they've got a reason why they're a genius. And I just found in that essay some examples of that um, where if the idea is more important than the execution, or like you say that the style is more important than the content, then you're safe from critique, right? Because and so it has a certain appeal to certain kinds of writers, but it's by no means limited to literature. It's just that's where in writing the essay I felt most at home in arm wrestling those issues, using literature as a lens. Um,
Do you think the acceptance of postmodernism so wholeheartedly in certain disciplines in the university is related to the hyper professionalization of university? Or you may even, I guess you could even like talk about yeah, how it's a very competitive place, and really at the time that postmodernism is coming into vogue and fully, promulgated and accepted, there's also like a shrinking of employment possibilities in universities. It's a much more competitive place. The hiring practices of universities change as they take on kind of the logic of corporations more so than their function as like a public service. And it seems to me that the professoriate changes in nature around the time that postmodernism is being accepted into many departments. Is that true, or am I on the wrong track
yeah,
here?
I know. I think you're absolutely accurate. The only distinction I would make was a lot of my teaching career was spent in the community college system in BC, and there it's absolutely not postmodern, and as a result, it's a lot more union conscious. Like it's 100% unionized. They were able to stop after a couple of long strikes at Douglas College. They were able to stop colleges using temporary professors. That whole world of sessionals was just stopped. So if you personally work the equivalent of 2 years at any place, you personally are given a full-time job. So instead of it being 45%, 55%, 65%, the way it is in in universities of precarious part-time sessionals, none of that goes on in the community college system, or it didn't prior to pandemic. God knows what the world's going to be like coming out of that pandemic, but they really managed with it because of a trade union consciousness and no postmodernism. They could focus on and stop that kind of exploitation of young people, and some not so young people too, because it would go on year after year after year. People be given these temporary contracts. Um, so yeah, that's the only difference I would make. I think in the universities it's deeply embedded for all the reasons that you mentioned.
There's something about how postmodernism or certain theories of some of its influential theories really make something that should be common, which is culture, art, literature, makes it elite again. And
Yes.
and I think that's one reason why, like, say, postmodernism really does a disservice to the study of literature in particular, because it is part of an elite attempt to kind of wrench the art and literature away from the common space where it can be commonly understood, and where it can be legible and discussed, and to make it again like the property of an elite, whereby it's used to just prove the superior credentials, superior intelligence, and superior sophistication of a group of people who will then talk about it and write about it. And that's something that I see postmodernism doing.
Yes, and I mean, why do we want people to read literature, right? It's if you suck all the enjoyment out of it, and it just becomes another club to beat people with, beat them down. It seems to me not a good use of human effort. I have to say too that the tangled kind of writing that postmodern critics use seems to me really um, out of step with what language can actually do. And my grounds of comparison, I don't think this is in the essay, but I've thought about it since, is that there are all these cosmologists, Brian Greene, Stephen Hawking, Stephen Weisenberg, that can take really difficult concepts of multiple dimensions, the string theory, the first minutes after the Big Bang, what might have existed before the Big Bang. Lawrence Krauss has that whole thing about why is there anything at all? There didn't used to be anything, and then suddenly you have a universe. Why? They can discuss those issues with incredible clarity. They can find metaphors so that someone like me, these books are aimed at a popular audience. They can convey very complicated ideas very clearly. And it seems to me that would be if there was any substance to postmodernism other than, like you say, trying to make people feel that they're an elite and other people are one in a one down position, that this stuff ought to be able to be explained clearly, but in fact it's not. It's obscurity piled on obscurity, or jargon piled on jargon. Whereas around them, there's these cosmologists who are able to talk to a much more general audience and try to communicate, like, not only here's what we know so far, but why this might be important, why you might want to pay attention to this stuff. So it seems increasingly out of step. I know that a lot of those folks, will cling to those ideas all the way through their career, but I don't think it's doing anybody any good. Is to sum it up. It certainly doesn't make people want to read more or get into literature.
Tom, maybe here, could I ask you to read another poem of yours, a more recent poem called "O Calgary"?
Okay, I'm going to say a few things about it, which the poem arises from a number of sources. One is in the area of southeastern British Columbia where I live. If some guy in a giant pickup passes you on a double yellow line, or cuts you off in traffic, or if someone buys a property near you and instantly they put up all these no trespassing signs, people here will look at each other and nod and say Albertans, and by which they mean Calgarians. That is, Calgary is seen here in the country as the repository of a set of ideas that I think comes out of some bad politics, and those ideas include that zero sum game thing we're talking about, where I have to win and you have to lose. It comes out of the idea that the only possible value there can be is money. It's the only way you can measure value. Nothing on the planet has value unless it can be converted into dollars. So that's the kind of background to the poem. I should also say, though, that Calgary is a city of 1 million people, so there's lots of good people in Calgary too. It's not just those kind of people. But what I'm critiquing here, if you like, is that set of ideas. The poem came about because I was reading a Santa Cruz, California poet that I really admire, Joseph Stroud, and I'm reading along in the poem, and suddenly he's got these two lines where he says, "In Calgary, I saw a man break a dog's back," and I almost fell out of my chair. And that's where I got the title of my last book, which is called "Watching a Man Break a Dog's Back." But that's the epigraph to this poem, which is called "O Calgary." And of course, the O is like "O Jerusalem." It's seeing a city as embodying ideas. It's not an attempt to accurately depict, an existing place. In Calgary, I saw a man marry money. "Who giveth this money?" the commissioner asked. The man said, "Everyone who works for me." The commissioner asked, "Well, where are they? I don't hear them declare it." The man said, "That's not their job. You do yours." Do you take this money? The commissioner asked. To have and to hold, till death do you part? The man replied, even longer. The commissioner said, money, do you take this man, etc.? Money said nothing, but the man said, it's my money. Our opinions are identical. In that case, the commissioner said, I hereby pronounce you one flesh. You heard the commissioner, the man said. What authority is joined together, let nobody dare separate. Got that? All of us, including money, were silent. In Calgary, I saw the toe of a cowboy boot rupture the spleen of a man begging. In Calgary, I heard a man praise his snow machine, how he and his friends like to have a few, then compete who can steer their skidoo furthest up their piles of money. High marking, they call it, the sled almost vertical, so the man, drunk, stands up on the footnotes as he climbs. Fuck yes, it's dangerous. 2 or 3 machines a month trigger at the apex, a vast, roaring slab of money that descends with the consistency of cement, impossible to outrun, entombing the perpetrator. Dumb fuck should have been more careful. In Calgary, I saw a man fire another man by inviting him to a conference room where an employee from HR waited with severance paperwork and a payment, along with someone from security to escort immediately out of the building the man whose livelihood had just been stripped. We don't want no trouble. In Calgary, I watched money overflow the banks along the Bow, sweeping hundreds of replicas of the same ample house out onto wheat fields surrounding the city. Saw the flood pour into downtown streets, office towers, machine shops, oil well maintenance yards, sending the inhabitants scrambling to survive. Dog eat dog, and I'm hungry. I watched the current surge into libraries, galleries, museums, to jumble, bury under debris, permanently stain. I saw couples in a bar trying to two-step, slipping and stumbling into each other due to the money pool on the floor. In Calgary, during a Wild West wagon race, I saw a horse sprawl to the ground, heard the snap. Leg broke, the animal finished in Calgary. And I heard a woman sobbing how money had always been her family's friend, provided heat and light, consoling, comforting, until suddenly it behaved as if envious of the little they had, ATV, wakeboarding boat and trailer, dually the Lexus, each as if transformed to dust or ash, she gasped as she wept. Money now hates us, took the new smartphones, bought each year the son's Xbox and PlayStation, the daughter's charter of a party limo for her birthday, Christmases in Hawaii, vacation condo in Mesa, Arizona, for no reason. Money hates our way of life, wants to destroy our freedom. Yours too, she sniffled. You have to help us.
Wonderful.
So,
You're a
pretty,
great reader, Tom.
well, no, thank you. It's a pretty grim thing, but people here do rant about those set of values, and so it was kind of fun to kind of let it all hang out in that way.
That comes after, you spent enough time in Calgary to get a sense of some of its darker elements.
Yeah,
So
but
you have a right to write a poem like that. It's okay.
but I do, even when I perform it, like I do try to point out that it's about the set of ideas, just like all the psalms that reference Jerusalem. They don't mean the city, which has dozens of religions and stuff. They mean a set of values or a set that they're praising or attacking. And so hence why it's called "Oh Calgary" rather than just Calgary. But yeah, I mean, you can find those same values here, actually, in my corner of the world too, even though they tend to blame it on Albertans. But it's actually here too. It's it's more about the values than than the geography or the a set of people.
Well, certainly, Calgary and Alberta, maybe generally, very often has been I mean, it has been the hotbed of
Yeah,
conservatism in Canada, where a lot of, um, and of course, as being the center of the oil and gas industry in Canada too, also comes with obviously certain values and a
yes,
certain way of
yes.
life too. So I really like that poem for that reason. So,
Well,
maybe
thank you.
yeah, maybe we'll finish up just with this last question. So, Tom, it seems to me that throughout all of your writing, that you want to connect the arts with this greater cause of democracy. You talk about workplace democracy, and that those two things are intimately linked in your mind. Arts and democracy. So, what is there about art that fosters or would foster democratic sentiments and capabilities?
Yeah, I thought this was a great question. And I guess my answer is that there's nothing inherent in art that promotes democracy. Art's been used in the service of virtually every totalitarian structure that's ever existed, from kings to um, the Nazis to totalitarian Stalinism. It in itself is neutral. It's just I see a tremendous potential for people talking about themselves, about their own experiences on the planet, and because for most people the job that they have is is not just the center of their day, but also where they contribute to the community. We talked before about probably all work is essential at some level, um, and it's essential because the community needs what you're doing. Um, so it just seems a chance in the whole history of art, um, to bring into art for the first time these concerns around, how can art serve democracy? How can the the, because it in a way it's a consequence of the democratization of education, because you don't have to go back very far to there was no mass public education. um, when I taught English, I would if it was a general course, I would always assign Dickens' Hard Times, which is about the beginning of mass public education. These are factory schools where kids are taught the factory virtues: shut up, sit down, be bored, be productive, don't ask questions. And that cast a big shadow forward for a long time, and but little by little it gets eroded. When I went to university in the 60s, only 15% of the population had access to post-secondary. Now it's over 50%. So we have a moment in human history that's never existed, and there's always a small percentage of people that are attracted to the arts. And here it comes from a different background than ever before. It's not that there weren't poor people that made art, John Clare, in English history, stuff like that. But it's just generally it wasn't open. People were too busy trying to survive and craft a life for themselves. When there was no social safety net, there was nothing. But now we've got this moment. It's a chance where art could be a generator of democracy. Reflecting the expanded opportunities that a couple of generations now have had, maybe three, and instead of that, as we've talked about, we've some things have come in to try to stop that happening, um, and I just think certainly what I do, and I know you do too, is to try to suggest there are other possibilities than going backwards to a kind of a elitist model, of um, of who gets to be educated, who gets to make art, what does that education look like, what does that art look like, how can we exclude the people that pay for that art through their taxes, or pay for that education through their taxes, how can we keep them at bay? I don't. It's kind of a retrograde motion that I think we're trying to work against. Just because, as I keep saying, it's the first time in human history where another possibility is there for art. And I guess in answer to your question, I'd say there's nothing inherent in art that makes it in the service of democracy, but there is a potential there that that I think is worth following. Um,
That's a great place to end, Tom. Thank you very much
yeah.
for talking with me today.
Okay, well, thank you very much.